Of all the home computer stories, Amiga is probably the most interesting, diverse and long. One reason for that is the number of machines Commodore produced for the Amiga line in an attempt to diversify and capture the market throughout the 80s and 90s. For that reason, and to ensure you have adequate toilet breaks, this documentary will be broken into two parts. And following in the lines of chronological ordering, we begin, like all these things, at the beginning. To do that, we have to travel almost 40 years back in time, way back in the mid-1970s. Atari were expanding. Having developed arcade machines for several years, they were looking to expand their technology into living rooms throughout the world. To assist with this, a gentleman by the name of J. Glenn Miner was recruited to develop custom integrated circuits by Harold Lee. Jay had been in the electronics industry for a number of years by this point, studying at electronics school in Groton, Connecticut, and progressing to electrical engineering at California Berkeley University in 1958. During his early work career, he worked at various startups, including General Microelectronics, where he gained an impressive knowledge of MOS technology. Armed with this knowledge, he successfully reduced the Atari 2600 display hardware down from a plethora of discrete components into a single television interface adapter chip. The 2600, as we know, went on to be one of the most successful consoles of all time. Immediately after, Jay would begin development on a new set of chips, the Color Television Interface Adapter, Alphanumeric Television Interface Controller, and POT Keyboard Integrated Circuit, offering input and output control for the line of new Atari 8-bit home computers. At the time, the designs Jay created were impressive, offering 40 on-screen colours and custom accelerated circuitry, allowing the 8-bit line to live well into the late 1980s. By this point, Atari had been sold to Warner Communications to provide suitable funding to market and deliver their home systems, but Ray Kassar, CEO and the new corporate management, was more interested in milking their current technology rather than advancing development. Jay and his team were keen to initiate a new project based around the spanking new Motorola 68000 chip, but with Atari uninterested, he left the company in 1980 and went into medical development for a company called Zymos, helping to create a remote-controlled pacemaker. Another Atari employee who had left around the same time was the first 2600 programmer, Larry Kaplan. Larry was unhappy with the lack of recognition Atari attributed to their designers, and had left in 1979 to found Activision, the first third-party game developer who put game creators at the core of their work. In 1982, with the console market slowing somewhat, Larry felt the urge to pursue something more exciting. After seeing the Nintendo Famicom at the Consumer Electronics Show, he contacted his former colleague Jay with the idea of creating a new company that would manufacture cartridges and peripherals for existing machines.
It's seat of the pants flying in all its glory.
Investment was needed, and along with a few wealthy dentists who were keen to cash in on the video game craze, Jay found additional interest courtesy of his current employment. Burt Braddock, Jay's boss at Zymos, was keen to get both on board and on the company's board. He quickly encouraged the Texas owner of Zymos to invest and agreed to the team using the Zymos Semiconductor Labs. And so, in June 1982, work began from a small office at 73350 Scott Boulevard, Santa Clara, with Larry as vice president and Jay in charge of the hardware. A chief executive and president was also brought on board, Dave Morse, head of marketing at Tonka Toys. And yes, that's the same Dave Morse who would go on to head up Epix. As we're discovering with these current documentaries, the same names crop up again and again. With a team in place and suitable investment, the name High Toro was conjured for the venture, sounding both high-tech and Texan. The founding idea was for Larry to design games for the Atari 2600 and other systems, whilst Jay designed chips for the cartridges and other new accessories. By October, Burt Braddock was keen for Nolan Bushnell to come on board as board of director chairman. Larry called up his old Atari boss to suggest it, but in a twist, Nolan ended up convincing Larry to come and work for him. Only a few months after setting up High Toro, Larry was gone and Dave would ask Jay to take his place. The company was then split into two segments. One division, under Dave Morse, would continue work on software and peripherals for existing game consoles, whilst under Jay's guidance, the other would begin to focus on his old dream of creating a new computer system based around the Motorola 68000 processor. This required some convincing for their dentist investors, but still excited by the growing games market, they agreed to Jay's plans to create a powerful new games console, whilst Jay slightly worked on the basis that it could be expandable to a full-blown computer. Codenamed Lorraine after the wife of Dave Morse, a naming tradition formed at Atari for labelling new chips after girlfriends, so outsiders didn't realise what they were discussing, the hardware plan was to create an advanced 16-bit gaming machine, following in the open development practices of Commodore's new 64 machine. Once the design was complete, the circuits could be hammered out at the Zymos Labs. 1983 would see the company name change to something friendly and welcoming, with their investors unhappy that the current name sounded too much like a Japanese lawnmower manufacturer, Toro. After several suggestions, including Amigo, the team finally settled on Amiga, a soft Spanish word meaning female friend. And, I don't know about you guys, but the Amiga kind of did feel like a female friend, I guess. Also, like Acorn Computers, it came above Apple and Atari in the phone book. This really was cutting-edge marketing for the 1980s. And so it was. The company was renamed to Amiga Incorporated with one main objective and one sideline to supply funds and act as cover for their secret technology. So, whilst Jay worked on hardware, the other division worked on devices such as the Power Stick and Joy Board, a kind of early Wii balance board, along with compatible titles such as Surf's Up and Mogul Mania. These products weren't really the success the team had hoped for, and some weren't even released, hindered further by the American video game crash of 1983, which also brought with it a considerable degree of nervousness from their investors. Thankfully, computer systems like the Apple II and the Commodore 64 were still selling well, and having unprecedented foresight, Jay reassured investors by convincing them that the new hardware could be sold as a full and powerful computer system from the go. However, additional investment was needed, for which Jay would have to remortgage his house and borrow from other sources to keep afloat. Steve Jobs also visited the company a few times around this point, but decided the hardware was too complicated to invest in.
No.
Throughout 1983, hardware development continued, aided by additional colleagues from Atari and driven by Jay's insatiable craving for design. The team Jay chose to recruit all had one thing in common: they were looking to change the world, and Jay's tolerant and flexible management style certainly helped this and crafted the feel of the Amiga. Members brought on board include programmers Dale Luck and RJ McCow, designers Joe DeCure and Dave Needle, and even Jay's beloved cockapoo, Mitchie, who came to work on a daily basis. The custom architecture wasn't new to Jay. The chips he designed at Atari are what made their 8-bit line so impressive at the time, offloading work from the 6502 CPU. Lorraine was also built around custom chip designs, freeing up cycles on the Motorola 68000 CPU, which, although meaning it would be more expensive to manufacture, also allowed for arcade rivaling graphics, something the entire team was very keen on nailing. The chips in question were originally called Portia,
Porsche chip,
Daphne and Agnes, and each had a specific task. Daphne would manage the display, Portia
Porsche chip,
was in charge of sound and I/O tasks, whilst Agnes synchronised them all to the CPU and memory, whilst also housing the copper and blitter circuitry, which gave the Amiga such impressive animation capabilities. One of Jay's inspirations for Daphne was a Link Trainer flight simulator machine, introduced to him by Al Pounds at manufacturer Singerlink. He wanted to use the blitter chip, which can push large amounts of graphics around a screen quickly, to refresh frames fast enough to create a flight simulator in the home. This simulator was also the inspiration to incorporate a ham mode, which means hold and modify. Now, this could place more colours on screen than memory allowed by changing the hue and saturation of existing pixels, and this laid the path for the Amiga's impressive 4096 simultaneous on-screen colour mode, although in these early stages it could only muster 324 at the same time. The complex designs were put together using wire and large boards in an anti-static area with an entrance sign saying "Ground thyself," as if you were entering a church of God. And in many ways that's almost true. In September 1983, Lorraine was completed in discrete form, which, although unsuitable for retail, allowed some impressive demonstrations to be coded up on the advanced hardware. Along with Amiga's sideline peripherals, one of these, the infamous bouncing ball, was on show at the January 1984 Winter CES, but cutting it fine was an understatement. At this point, the system had to be constantly maintained as components failed on the fly. Bob Paraseau had been brought on as Chief of Software Design, but hadn't had time to implement a suitable operating system. So RJ McCall and Dale Luck worked non-stop at the show to come up with something worthy of presentation. Lorraine didn't even have a keyboard at this point, and software had to be uploaded via a Sage 4 remote terminal. The result was a red and white checkered ball that, according to Dale, only bounced up and down at this point, with no horizontal movement nor sound effects. But even so, it was enough to spark the interest of several investors who witnessed the system in a VIP-only back room. And God knows that Amiga needed the money again at this point, badly. Even the transportation of their equipment was done on the cheap by booking an extra airline seat and wedging it between them under the name of Joe Pillow, with a smiley face drawn on for good effect. Amiga struggled on through the first half of 1984, fueled by passion, loans and foam baseball bats, which the team would use to settle disputes.
We worked in what we call the software cave, which was a room I'd say about 30 feet by 15 feet or 20 feet.
RJ McCall even wrote a meditation program for the Joy board, where you had to sit as still for as long as possible without registering its sensors. This became a running joke and the inspiration for the fabled Guru meditation era we're all very familiar with. The kit was condensed a little, although still strewn across a variety of breadboards and hundreds of MSI logic chips, which accurately simulated the Amiga, albeit at a somewhat slower pace. And the bouncing ball demo was improved, akin to the version we're all familiar with today. Bob Paraseau, Dale Luck, RJ McCall and recruit Carl Sassenrath had also got stuck into the task of creating a suitable operating system, and the team would arrive ready for the June-summer CES with their latest hardware and bouncing ball demo, this time on wider display. But what was it about this ball which garnered so much interest? Well, the initial draw was the sheer size of the ball. Remember, this was an era when computer animation was always on the smaller side. There simply wasn't enough power to chuck a ton of pixels around in unison. The Boeing demo was a whopping 140 by 100 pixels and seemed to jig around the screen completely seamlessly with a mesmerising fluidity, much like modern 3D rendering. However, there were some cunning tricks behind Lorraine's big bouncing ball, thanks in part to the design of the hardware. Rather than mapping out 14 frames of animation, through clever cycling of colour registers, the ball was completed using just one. The sound echoing from the ball is also from a single sample, simply by changing the speed and volume. Bob was recorded hitting an aluminium garage door with one of those foam bats, and an Apple II digitised it from inside the garage. The demo is a testament to not only the team's advanced hardware, but also to their sheer programming skill, creating something brilliant in a limited time and with limited resources. But this wasn't their only trick. By now, RJ McCall had created the basis of an application programming interface called Intuition. This was a window-driven operating system which took 7 months of 100-hour weeks, and like others was based around an early Xerox environment from the late 1970s. Combined with the Boeing demo, the first glimmers of multitasking, thanks to Carl Sassenrath's revolutionary multitasking kernel called exec, were tantalizingly evident.
Well, if you come here, you can design whatever operating system you want. I said, I'll do a multitasking operating system.
But really, it was unnecessary. By now, several big names were interested in Amiga's technology, keen to forge their place in the evergreen and rapidly evolving computer market. The main two were Commodore and Atari, who were eager to jump onto the 16-bit bandwagon. However, with Commodore kicking its heels, it was Atari who stepped up first, offering to buy 1 million shares in Amiga at $3 each, whilst keeping the financially struggling company afloat with a $500,000 loan, whilst buyout preparations were formalised. However, the contract for the loan was a strict one, requiring Amiga to repay the entire loan within a month, or Atari would be able to snap up their company for next to nothing.
Get to send me a copy.
And clearly a filthy move designed to work in Atari's favour, but Amiga was so desperate they had no choice.
Well, it's a little late to get this kind of feedback.
Strangely, Atari weren't even interested in finishing the computer Jay and his team had come so close to completing. Instead, they were looking to use the custom chips in their own machines. Behind closed doors, however, at Atari's parent company, Time Warner, negotiations were taking place to find a buyer for Atari, as it was currently losing some $10,000 per day. James Morgan, CEO of Atari, was even unaware of these negotiations himself, hence operations were business as usual. One of these negotiators in early July was Jack Tramiel. Having recently left Commodore over disagreements, he was looking for a new venture to sink into, and Atari seemed ripe for the picking. A deal was quickly drawn up and Jack became the owner of Atari's consumer division, which was renamed to Atari Corporation. He would also become a proud new investor, owner of Amiga Incorporated at this point too, if it hadn't been for his former company, Commodore. With Jack and his team of engineers departed from Commodore, the company was keen for a new machine, and although late to the party, swept in before June was out and bought out Amiga from right underneath Atari's noses. This included the repayment with interest of the $500,000 loan and a $4.24 per share investment in Amiga, taking ownership and bringing them in-house as the new Commodore Amiga Incorporated.
$4 a share. That's our final offer. You're out of time. You can either accept it or, not and go with Atari. They write him out a check for $500,000. He hops in the jet. He flies back to Atari headquarters. Morse, yeah, glad to see you. Come on in. We got some papers for you. He takes that check. He slams it down on the table and says, "See you, boys. I got a plane to catch." Yeah.
Upon finding this out, Jack was a little skived and set about suing Jay and Commodore for breach of contract for $100 million on August the 13th, which would finally be settled out of court after a few years of shouting legalities at each other. Still, disruption was minimal for Jack as he began to work on his own new 16-bit machine, which would soon become known as the ST. Back at Amiga, Commodore set about investing a further $20 million in the development of a new machine. Jay and his team may not have held the exclusive reins anymore, but they were now on safe and stable footing for the first time since 1983, at the company Jack Tramiel had first founded in 1955. Things were looking good.
All of a sudden there was Commodore and there was money.
Yeah.
And then there was a big building and the blueprints. Remember the blueprints?
Yeah.
Like, this is how we're going to do the offices. And like, how do you want to do software? How do you want to do hardware?
The first task was to move the team out of their pokey little office into a spacious facility down the road in Los Gatos, California. More engineers were brought on board to expedite proceedings, and their single Sage workstation was subsidised with another 10 so that everyone could work simultaneously. Work quickly progressed on two vital areas. The first was the chip design. Daphne was renamed to Denise, Portia
chip.
to Paula, and a lot of refinement began, including some technical improvements. An increased memory from 128 to 256K, and of course condensing the massive prototypes onto actual silicon chips. Although the team, RJ Macau in particular, had completed some exemplary work on the operating system, which was now dubbed Chaos, standing for Commodore Amiga Operating System, it was still taking time to develop into a usable system and needed operating system fundamentals such as file handling and resource routines. As part of the buyout, Commodore had imposed their own strict deadlines to get the system out to market, and so employed Metacomco to port a version of Trip OS and incorporate it into the Intuition code. Trip OS was originally developed at Cambridge University on an IBM 3081. This was then ported to the Motorola 68000 by Dr. Tim King. Its fit with the Motorola chip meant that modifying it for the Lorraine chipset was reasonably straightforward. However, the final results were still far below the original visions of Jay and his team, lacking many of the features they had intended, including resource tracking, which would free up resources on the fly, and a technically advanced file system. It also led to some problems with memory protection, which caused some issues with early versions of the Amiga operating system.
It would go out and it'd say, give me some memory, and it would never check to see if it got it. It just assumed it got it.
Still, Workbench, working alongside the Kickstart boot ROM, made for a cutting-edge operating system experience compared to rival systems. This was still a time before Windows 1 had even been released. Aside from the technical aspects, there was also the aesthetics of a new computer to deal with. Jay had a whole swathe of design drawings which had already progressed, showcasing an elegant system in line with desktop systems like the IBM PC Junior. But some additional tweaks were put into place, including a garage unit which allowed the keyboard to fit under the machine, suggested by Dave Morse, who was still present and managing the subsidiary, along with a pencil holder on the keyboard and a stereo startup tune. Not only did Amiga put a lot of time into the machine, but Commodore did as well, fully in the belief that they had hit the holy grail of the computing world. Just 11 months after the purchase of Amiga Incorporated, the Commodore Amiga was unveiled at a lavish New York show at the Lincoln Center on the 23rd of July 1985. For this grand event, a full orchestra was hired, all the Commodore and Amiga employees were shipped over, and a lavish display was presented.
Commodore welcomes you to Lincoln Center. My name is Bob Truckenbrode.
Commodore's Vice President, Bob Truckenbrode, hosted the show, but it was Bob Paraso who took charge of the machine's real demonstrations. In many respects, the event was designed like a flamboyant version of the Apple Macintosh launch, and it showed the key standout abilities of the new machine.
This is an image that's been in the graphics community for some time. The infamous mandrel, shown here in 640 by 400 pixel resolution. They've been brought up in Windows. In fact, there are 2 copies of the mandrel up there. I wouldn't want to meet that in the dark alley.
But purpose and direction felt a little lacking. To end the display, the old faithful Boeing demo was back, this time running on a full-blown Amiga OS with Workbench file management and Intuition Windows, allowing tasks to be run simultaneously in the background whilst the ball bounced on regardless. The ball had become so synonymous with Amiga that it was originally used for its official logo, something that holds true in more recent times, but Commodore decided to replace it with a rainbow checkmark similar to the style of their earlier Commodore 64 detailing, in a bid to identify the Amiga as a continuation of their earlier and somewhat equally as impressive hardware. The show was finalised by Andy Warhol and Deborah Harry of Blondie fame, joining each other on stage to showcase some of the machine's graphical abilities, along with a helping hand of resident Amiga artist Jack Hagar. The paint program in question, called ProPaint, was still in its alpha stages and had known bugs with the flood fill tool. However, blissfully unaware, Warhol went off on a flood fill pandemic, seemingly pushing the software to breaking point. But thankfully for Amiga, no freezes or glitches occurred on that day.
What computers have you worked on before?
Oh, I've worked on anything. I've waited for this one.
Really?
Press coverage of the show seemed somewhat mixed. People were clearly impressed with the Amiga's abilities, but the system was perhaps so far ahead of its time that many didn't know what these features could even be used for. It seems a little absurd now, but the industry was quite well entrenched in the IBM PC compatible landscape of blandness. The Amiga was just pissing all over that, and people didn't know how to react. The original machine was available as either a 256KB variant or 512KB via a front expansion upgrade, something Jay had to plead with Commodore to incorporate, knowing that 256K just wouldn't be enough after the operating system was loaded into memory.
And I insisted, they said, well, you're liable to not close the deal and you're liable to lose your job.
Other than being able to read to and from disk, there was very little in the way of ROM at this point also, with Kickstart loaded via disk into a 256KB write control store area of memory, which remained resident until power off. One reason for this was to iron out bugs in the code before incorporating a complete Kickstart ROM chip. At the machine's heart was of course the Motorola 68000 chip clocked at 7.16 MHz or 7.09 MHz in PAL regions. The custom chipset, later known as the OCS or original chipset, comprised of our friends Agnes, incorporating the Blitter block image transfer processor, and the Copper coprocessor. Demise is on hand to fetch planar video data from the Amiga's bitplanes and translate it into a colour lookup, as well as handling other video modes. She can provide a borderless display with 640 by 256 pixels on PAL screens, which can be vertically doubled for interlaced display. Demise can also handle 8 16-pixel wide sprites on 3 separate layers in 4 colours, including transparent, or 15 colours when combined. Paula is still handling input and output, including the floppy drive, serial port and mouse ports, but also holds the Amiga's audio capabilities. She comes with 4 DMA-based 8-bit sample channels split to allow stereo audio and allows one channel to modulate another channel's output, allowing for basic FM synthesis effects. Data is held by a 3.5-inch double-density floppy drive offering 880 kilobytes of capacity, and a single Zorro 1 card slot is provided on the right of the machine for expansion. Port-wise, the machine has a keyboard port, 2 mouse ports, an RS-232 serial interface, Centronics parallel access, and an additional floppy drive connector. For video, there's an analog RGB out, a TV mod output that can be used with an additional RF modulator, and composite outputs. As a tribute to its creators who put their heart and soul into this machine, the original models bear the moulded markings of the entire team's signatures, including a paw print from Faithful Mitchie, who Jay apparently posed questions to and based many a decision around her canine response.
Well, do I put this gate here? And he thinks about it and see draw gate. He looked down at Mitchie. And Mitchie would go, and so he'd erase it, and he'd draw it.
In its sleek, low-profile package, the Commodore Amiga looked ahead of its time both technically and aesthetically. Released for $1,495 for the 512KB model and $1,295 for the 256KB iteration in North America, an analog RGB monitor was available for an additional $300, bringing the cheapest package to $1,595. This was a price beyond most casual users, but still half the price of a 128KB Macintosh at $2,495 and cheaper than IBM PC AT machines, whilst packing a hell of a lot more power. However, there was one slight thorn in this issue. Whilst Commodore were frantically building away, Jack Tramiel and his team of ex-Commodore staff over at Atari had been working even more frantically, and had thus been successful in launching the Atari 520 ST a whole month earlier, and not only that, but at a far cheaper price, $799 with a monochrome monitor and $999 for colour. If you consider that the Amiga didn't even come with a monitor as standard, this was one hell of a deal. Of course, it's true that the Atari ST didn't have the same custom abilities as the Amiga, but even without those chips, Jack's machine was still pretty advanced in itself. It also had the head start, further confounded by Commodore not getting Amigas out until November, and crucially, it had the price. Rather than unveiling a golden ticket unrivaled by other machines, Jack had got back at his former company within just a few months and thrown Commodore Amiga into a furious competition from the go. By riding on high development costs and choosing a price point over $1,000, Commodore had immediately placed their Amiga into the high-end computer workstation market, fighting the likes of Apple and IBM. This was a market where software mattered, where spreadsheets and productivity were king, and as a new machine, the Amiga simply lacked a great deal of software. Atari's pricing, on the other hand, had placed their machine as a big player in an entry-level price zone, opening up the system for a swathe of new users wanting to get into something new and exciting. This early discrepancy meant the ST was initially outselling the Amiga, and as a result gathering a reasonable degree of software houses looking to work on it, including game developers. But Amiga still did have the wow factor, along with a few other cards beginning to fall nicely from their sleeves. One of these cards came from the then innovative Electronic Arts, headed by the familiar face of Trip Hawkins. Before, after and during the Amiga's debut, the aspect which received the most interest was its remarkable graphics capabilities. Able to display 32 colours on screen from a palette of 4096 in low res and 16 in high res, not to mention its 64 and even 4096 full on-screen colour ham mode. These abilities dumped all over Apple's monochrome Mac, IBM's 4-colour CGA, and even beat the Atari ST's maximum of 16 out of a palette of 512. The various Amiga demos showcased these abilities, but if software was available which allowed users to really capitalise on this ability, then the purpose of the Amiga would start to become clear. Deluxe Paint, a rewrite of their Prism package for DOS, really brought the tools to the table, and artists inspired by the appearance and continued work of Warhol on the machine began popping up. In a shrewd move, Commodore had given EA access to prototype machines several months ahead of the launch date, allowing Trip Hawkins and his team to really see the machine's potential. Before this point, most programs had their own file formats, in a bid to lock users into their line of software. However, EA were the first to really integrate a literal interchangeable file format into their package, developed by Jerry Morrison. This IFF format acted as a container, allowing images, sound, graphics and animations to all adopt this universal format. Combined with the new features offered in Deluxe Paint, which rather than presenting basic digital tools, seemed to recreate an artist studio in the computer, it opened up a doorway for a generation of new artists and graphical tweakers who could begin to unlock the wonders of this new machine, or just play around with the wealth of colour and bathe in its on-screen glory. If the IBM had found its niche with business and spreadsheet programs, the Mac with desktop publishing and the ST with music production, the Amiga was just beginning to find its footing in the world of graphical superiority. Released in November 1985, Deluxe Paint was one of the first in a line of Electronic Arts releases which would help propel the Amiga forward and solidify its place in computer history. Strangely, games, the software genre the machine was apparently ideal and originally developed for, had barely got a mention so far. There was one game which had been developed by Commodore themselves, but the launch party was devoid of any nod, and Commodore seemed to be glossing over the subject altogether.
You just cocked it up. It's okay. It happens.
This was, alas, an early sign of the mismanagement the Amiga would receive as Commodore tried to establish its identity and purpose. The trap they had fallen into was the trap of the serious. The notion that expensive technology can't be seen as a frivolous entertainment machine at the cost of losing credibility. This was in part a notion IBM and Apple had come up with to make their machines' lack of graphical and sound abilities come across as a selling point. Rather than breaking this mould and declaring how revolutionary and ideal for the task their machine was, Commodore fell right into it, opting for the business computer pitch. And although games would also immediately begin to emerge on the system, they didn't really showcase the hardware, mostly being conversions from other, lesser machines, or just ports from games which were already available on the Atari ST. In part, Commodore still viewed their 64 as the low-end gaming machine, which indeed it was, but the market was ready for a leading light, something to shine the way, even at a high price. Commodore were also under some strain, having confusingly launched their original line upgrade, the Commodore 128, earlier in the year.
Commodore 128, you used it for your homework. You'd use it to get dates.
Alongside the poorly selling Plus 4 range. Their resources and profits were becoming thinner. The Commodore 64 was still being sold and selling well at big retail chains, but the Amiga wasn't even stocked in them, with Commodore even turning down an offer for Sears to stock their new hardware, an outlet where Atari STs were stocked and selling. Instead, Commodore seemed to continue their emulation of Apple's sales techniques, with a zombie-based advert similar to Apple's famous 1984 ad, and a bizarre presentation based on 2001: A Space Odyssey.
experience the mind unbounded. Amiga, the first personal computer that gives you a creative...
The advertising continued, apparently trying to sell alone off the Amiga's abilities, and even moved to the soulless comparison shots before the year was out. Combined with delayed production, lackluster personality and muddled direction, the Amiga only sold 35,000 units in 1985, and this wasn't helping with Commodore's cash flow, leading to the company bailing on the January 1986 Consumer Electronics Show. This didn't go amiss from the press, who noted that after establishing their brand at that very show, it was akin to Russia resigning from the Soviet bloc. Thomas Rattigan, former CEO of PepsiCo International, was installed as CEO in February 1986, replacing Marshall Smith, and immediately began a much-needed plan to redirect the company's operations and make the most of their frankly groundbreaking technology. By now the Amiga was selling approximately 10,000 machines per month, a figure the Atari ST was beating, along with dealer sign-ups and software support, leading to further software ports from the ST, which just made the Amiga look like a high-cost version of the ST. Rattigan's plan was to first cancel well overdue lines such as the PET, VIC-20 and Plus 4, and then create two versions of the Amiga hardware. The first would be a high-end desktop aimed at the creative markets. The second would be a cost-reduced version designed to replace Commodore's 64 and 128 models. Finally, a clear path was beginning to be laid. Whilst these plans were being laid, Jay's original team based in Los Gatos were clearly still disgruntled by the handling of their precious technology. To this end, whilst working on Workbench 1.1, an unnamed engineer tucked an Easter egg into the operating system that would appear when a certain combination of keys were pressed. RJ Macau discovered it and, although finding it amusing, asked the engineer to change it. However, it was merely encrypted, and the first batch of European PAL Amigas flashed a message on screen for 1/60th of a second if you held down 8 keys and inserted a disc at the same time. Apparently someone with keen eyes spotted this and recorded the output to a VCR, which even with shoddy 1980s frame praisability allowed it to be shown to Amiga executives, who quickly pulled thousands of machines from UK shelves. Given that it was unlikely to ever be found by users, pulling the machines and suffering a 3-month sales delay whilst new ROMs were fitted seems a costly and strange measure to take, but then it wouldn't be the first we've encountered in the Amiga saga. Shortly after, Commodore decided to move the Los Gatos team closer to headquarters in West Chester, Pennsylvania, whilst making several layoffs in the process due to cost cutting. Some of the remaining team did as bade, however Jay Miner had had enough and decided to exit the endeavour as an official employee, and instead work as an external consultant for the company from his hometown. To further reduce Commodore's overheads, staff and other internal projects were discarded. This included projects like the Commodore 900 Unix workstation and even Commodore's office branding and supplies, which had helped establish the company in its infancy. Rattigan then set about his own plans. Proposals for the high-end machine were first given to Commodore's German subsidiary, who had recently been responsible for launching Commodore's IBM PC-compatible range. Armed with this fresh knowledge, their idea was to incorporate an open architecture into the new Amiga, expanding the bus and allowing ISA cards as well as Amiga Zorro cards to be added. A dedicated video slot was also introduced, allowing a Genlock card upgrade. This allowed computer images to be placed on top of video seamlessly and fitted perfectly with the Amiga's native video editing abilities.
Oh yeah.
The Amiga was really defining the multimedia platform as it went.
Great. If you see me, give me a wave. I love to see style.
And it would pave Amiga's way as the standard used in the video industry.
The images from the Amiga are combined with video via a Genlock and keyer. Solarization and mirror image. Slow motion can be enhanced with strobe effect.
The final case and keyboard wasn't as elegant as the original model, but that's in part thanks to another cost-cutting measure of using the cancelled Commodore 900 workstation case as the housing. The new machine, launching in March 1987, would be called the Amiga 2000, instigating a name change of the original Commodore Amiga to the Amiga 1000. It retailed for a hefty $2,395, armed with 1MB of RAM as standard and including a monitor from the off. Immediately its path was sown and advertising was launched, hitting home the machine's intended niche and selling points.
Well, the Amiga is like having a type shop in my studio.
At the other end of the scale, work had also begun on a low-end Amiga, dubbed the 500. Engineer George Robbins was keen to jump onto the project from the go, having pitched for such a machine from the start, fitting much more in line with Commodore's earlier systems and indeed the expectations of developers and consumers alike. Commodore's core group of engineers were put to the task on the machine with Jeff Porter in charge, who had previously been working on a cancelled Commodore laptop. Along with Robbins, Bob Welland heads up the engineering of the system, who set about shrinking the Amiga 1000 hardware, along with some subtle improvements. One of these was the upgrade of Agnes to Fat Agnes, allowing the system to be upgraded with 512KB of pseudo-fast RAM. The motherboards were codenamed after a B-52 song, Rock Lobster, which you can find printed on the boards, and a trend which would continue with future Amiga variations. The new case design was very much conceived to flow from earlier Commodore machines and the recently revamped Commodore 64C model, and so a sleek wedge case was moulded offering floppy disk access on the side, much like Atari's also updated 520ST-FM model. It seemed whatever Amiga were doing, Atari were always so very slightly ahead.
You are about to step into a brave new world of power, performance, and productivity made possible by the new Commodore Amiga 500 home computer.
Still, the Amiga 500 was planned for launch in July 1987, but arrived a few months late in October for the budget price of $699 in North America and £499 in the UK, and was ready to go head-to-head with the Atari ST and wangle its way into homes and living rooms throughout the world.
A home office productivity wonder. I am extraordinary home video production and special effects, a versatile composer of thought as well as music. I am arcade quality games in stereo, a teacher of fact, and a teller of tales.
Not long after this, the 2000 model, having shipped 60,000 units, was updated to include some of the 500's design improvements, with US-based engineers Dave Haney and Terry Fisher taking the task to hand. A new Buster chip was integrated to manage the expansion bus, also allowing plug-and-play functionality, another ahead-of-its-time feature. A coprocessor interface was added for CPU upgrades, and of course Fat Agnes was integrated, giving the 2000 a much-needed 1MB pure chip memory boost, which allowed Agnes and the CPU to access the full 1MB. It appears that once again Commodore were finding their footing. Thomas Rattigan had begun to turn things around, posting $28 million in profits for the previous financial year. But yet this apparently displeased chairman Irving Gold, who seemingly had a bone to pick with Rattigan, possibly an egotistical disturbance, it's hard to be sure, but Gold accused Rattigan of conducting himself in a high-profile manner, whatever the hell that means. To me it sounds like he just didn't like the guy, and a consulting firm hired by Gould quickly concluded that Rattigan should be fired. This was promptly executed by Gould in April 1987, and Rattigan found himself booted out of Commodore the very next day to the bewilderment of his fellow staff members. He would subsequently sue Commodore for breach of contract and finally win in 1991 for $9 million, but be unable to complete the work he had begun. We'll never know what difference he would have made to the greater picture of Amiga, but for now, Commodore had two new machines and a healthier set of accounts, and was about to launch the Sidecar, allowing the 1000 to serve as a full PC XT clone. So what about software for these machines? After all, we know it's pretty essential. Well, ready for the 500 in particular, one game had shone the way since the late 1986 World of Commodore show. Defender of the Crown almost defined a new genre of game. It burst open the boundaries of experience you could reap from a gaming world previously filled with abstract concepts or frantic action. Here was a game which, as its appropriately named creators had envisaged, was essentially a play-along film. For the Amiga, it was an experience which tied well with the multimedia principles the hardware was designed for. Underneath, it's really a Risk-like game dotted with a plethora of mini-games, but it was the colourful, high-quality graphics which really caught the eye of gamers currently squinting at their 8-bit screens. Older hardware really needed an overlay of imagination to bring it to life. In Defender of the Crown, there was no need. Bob Jacob, CinemaWare's founder, was no stranger to game development, having worked on a number of Commodore 64 titles, but having witnessed the Amiga in its early days, he really got a sense of what the machine could do, and built a development company to specifically take advantage of that. Although even the best Amiga games were selling only 25,000 copies in 1986, Commodore 64 versions were selling well over 100,000. Jacob's idea was to wow the press and consumers with the Amiga game releases and then follow them up with cut-down versions on other hardware. It was a strategy which worked and really set the scene for the Amiga as the games machine it was. Almost 200,000 Amigas had been sold by the end of 1986, but the new 1987 machines heralded a different approach, and keen to gloss over their earlier mishaps, Commodore asked the press to refer to the new machines as the Amiga from Commodore, with new logo designs on the cases. This pushed the Amiga as almost a separate entity, and helped dispense confusion from Commodore's continued Commodore 64 and 128 lines. With the Amiga 500 launched, sales began to pick up in the all-important home market, but the machines were still expensive and relied on their impressive capabilities to sell. Nintendo was currently dominating the home console market with the NES in North America, and Sega were gaining traction with the Master System in other regions. These consoles were cheaper than home computers, in part because they relied on receiving most of their revenue from game licensing models. This meant that although hardware was cheap, games were more expensive, and it was also harder to publish on them. And one of the distinct advantages with machines like the Amiga was their open platform. Practically anyone could create their own software on disk and publish it. This quickly meant a wave of new software was created for the machines. Some conversions from the Atari ST, some brand new, and some was just coded by people at home and released as public domain software. An area which would grow rapidly over the next few years. Although the new systems were selling in America, it was over in Europe where things were looking much more rosy. Since its launch, the Atari ST-FM in particular had gained a strong foothold as the must-have computer upgrade for current Sinclair Spectrum, Amstrad and Commodore 64 owners. And this was a region much more used to plonking full-blown computers in front of a living room television for both gaming and general tinkering. It's this tinkering which grew the number of European development houses so quickly, and eager for new technology, many of these developers had moved onto the ST when it arrived. Armed with the Motorola 68000 chip knowledge, the Amiga seemed a natural and exciting progression, and although in the UK only some 50,500 machines were sold in the first year, soon games were released which really took advantage of its custom hardware. In 1988, the number of 500 systems sold increased in the same region to almost 150,000, and it looked like Commodore UK and European-based gamers, at least, were onto a winner. Another key reason for this was the tactics which Commodore UK employed over their American counterparts. Instead of bundling the Amiga 500 with business and educational software, followed by further mundane adverts, David Pleasance, the UK sales and marketing director, set about creating entertainment-based packs which echoed earlier bundles from Commodore and even Sinclair under Amstrad's rule. One of these packages in particular was the Batman pack, incorporating an Amiga 500 along with the new Batman game based on Tim Burton's 1989 classic, as well as the New Zealand story, Interceptor and Deluxe Paint 2 for just £399. A similar pack was also released for the Commodore 64, but the Amiga was exciting, it was powerful, it was glorious. These key moves increased annual machine sales to over 200,000 in the UK alone by 1989. And what's more, the Amiga was just getting started.
Only Amiga makes it possible.
Only Amiga makes it possible. Only.
Thank you for watching this first part of the Amiga story. We'll conclude in the second part with the 1990s. If you subscribe, you'll stay updated as to when that comes out. In the meantime, you can click a video on screen now, you can click the like or dislike button, you can share it on Twitter, or you can even contribute to my Patreon to keep the channel going and receive some rewards. In any case, I thank you very much for watching and I hope you have a very enjoyable evening. Good night.